The story begins with a nerdy kid reading about some epic wizard who totally destroys the Demon King after fighting him for like a gazillion seasons. The boy wants to become a badass wizard too. Years later, a chick named Josephine is running late to class like she always does. She waves to her close friend Jessica, who is always gossiping, since they plan to ditch history and chat about their former teacher, who just quit to become an influencer loser. On their way to magic school, Josephine and Jessica gossip about who the new substitute could be. Suddenly, some tool comes running and crashes into them like a moron. Josephine uses her magic to stop him because she's such a heroic gal. To their surprise, it's Glenn, a total arrogant womanizing playboy. Josephine sarcastically apologizes, but promises she'll beat his ass if he keeps acting like a jerk. Glenn just laughs like an idiot and blames her for everything because he's a complete tool. But then he sees Jessica's face and just stares at her like she's a Tinder match. Indignant, Josephine uses her magic to teach Glenn a lesson and bounces with Jessica, leaving that loser behind. Later, the gals arrive to class expecting the famous new substitute teacher. But to their surprise, the arrogant Glenn shows up saying he's the new teach. The girls can't believe the womanizing playboy is now their mentor. Meanwhile, the old teacher argues with the principal because he thinks Glenn is a useless noob who only knows lame birthday party tricks. But the principal says they hired Glenn because of a recommendation from Celia, a super powerful mage and professor. Old dude keeps complaining like he's in a union. Just then, Celia shows up and threatens the old guy for dissing Glenn, saying she's cared for Glenn since he was a kid and loves him. Celia tells the principal she'll take responsibility for Glenn's performance. In another scene, we see Glenn telling the students they can do whatever in his class. Then the idiot falls asleep snoring, so Josephine gets pissed and throws a book to wake him up. Begrudgingly, Glenn starts teaching. The kids realize his handwriting is as messy as a doctor's, and no one can understand his nonsense. Then Lynn asks him a simple question about magic, and Glenn honestly says he has no freaking clue. Later, Josephine is in the cafeteria gossiping with Jessica. Glenn shows up and interrupts them like a pest. He starts joking with the gals, pissing off Josephine. Before she can kick his ass out of there, Glenn interrupts again, giving her some of the cheapest food he could find. Then the mooch eats Josephine's lunch right in front of her shocked face. In another scene, we see Celia observing the academy all serious-like. We flash back to months earlier, where Celia basically forces the lazy bum Glenn to become the new teacher. Dude doesn't want to work at all, but Celia uses her powers to wreck his house, so Glenn agrees to be the new teach. Back in the present, Glenn keeps slacking off in class, sleeping through lessons. Josephine gets mad and threatens to report him, but Glenn gets excited and tells her to go ahead. After this, Josephine challenges Glenn to a magic duel, and he hypedly accepts. They head to the courtyard. If Josephine wins, Glenn's got to take his job seriously. Glenn agrees to the bet. They prepare like an old Western draw. But Josephine is quicker and casts her spell first. Glenn pulls out his wand, but it is too short, and he ends quickly. He tries to counter, but Josephine hits him hard again, making everyone think Glenn's weak sauce. Glenn admits defeat, but then reminds Josephine they didn't bet anything. The next day, Lynn asks Glenn another dumb magic question, but Josephine shuts her down, saying not to ask him for help because he doesn't get magic's greatness. Glenn asks what good magic does for people when science and medicine can do the same things. Hearing this, Josephine gets furious and slaps him hard, storming out of class crying. After this, we see Glenn reflecting on his crappy attitude alone on the roof. But then Glenn realizes Jessica is inside the lab, so he goes over to her. He asks her to keep working on the magic circle she's making, but Jessica says she doesn't know how to make it work. So Glenn tells her the circle needs a crap load of mercury to work. He grabs some from a container and pours it on the circle, and with that, Jessica manages to activate her circle, getting all excited. Seeing this, the wacko teacher starts getting reflected in Jessica, and he also activates his circle, getting pumped. After this experiment, Glenn starts chatting with Jessica. She asks what he did before becoming a teacher. Glenn says he was unemployed for a year, just chilling at home, watching Netflix 24/7. But then he ran out of money, so he had to start streaming bootleg movies and shows on shady sites full of annoying ads. He was watching sketchy stuff like Moopy the Privateer and other junky animations, trying to find episodes between pop-ups for discount meds. Jessica asks what he did before that year of being a lazy couch potato, but Glenn changes the subject, saying it's not worth talking about his lame past of clicking out of ads on janky streaming sites. Instead, he asks Jessica why she's interested in magic. She explains that years ago she was kidnapped by some thugs but was saved by a powerful mage. So now she wants to learn more about magic. Hearing this, Glenn starts reflecting on the use of magic. The next day we see him apologize to Josephine, admitting he acted like a jerk. After this, Glenn decides to teach Class 2 how to actually use magic, since he realized the way they were doing it was whack as hell. He uses the shock bolt spell as an example, showing them the way they're casting is straight booty. After demonstrating some examples, he tells his students magic is about studying your feels and thoughts and how that junk influences spellcasting. Then he blows their minds by casting shock bolt with just one word. Everyone craps their pants seeing him pull it off. Glenn tells them the crusty textbooks they've been using are only good for memorizing spells. But before memorizing, they should try understanding magic. Days later, we see Glenn becoming super popular at the academy, with groupies from other classes sitting in trying to learn from the master. After finishing class, Glenn goes to the rooftop and thinks, maybe teaching isn't total garbage after all. Then Celia shows up and congratulates Glenn on not sucking as a teacher anymore. Glenn apologizes to Celia for worrying her earlier when he was being a pathetic loser. This makes Celia smile. She says she's got an academy staff meeting, so Glenn's class is the only one staying because they need extra help since they're idiots. The next day, Glenn shows up late to class again, but notices some creep following him. He tells the weirdo to show himself. Some nasty thug appears and tries to deck Glenn in the face. Meanwhile, Class 2 waits for their tardy teacher to show up, but instead 2 more nasty thugs appear. We learn their leader is some dude named Stinkfoot. Him and his stooge start asking for Jessica. When they find her, they decide to take her hostage, along with the rest of the scaredy cat students. On the way, it's revealed Jessica is actually the princess of the kingdom who supposedly died years ago. Meanwhile, one of the jerks is left alone with Josephine, planning to get his creep on with her. But suddenly Glenn shows up and sees this skeevy situation. The thug tries to blast Glenn with magic, but it fizzles out instantly. Dude is shocked that his magic didn't work. Glenn explains he has a unique skill called Crazy Lockout, which can seal any magic within an area. He mentions it affects his magic too. But then Glenn starts beating down the thug using Kung Fu, easily owning the loser. We learn Glenn can beat down any punk with his fists from before joining the academy. He knocks out the creep trying to get with Josephine. After this, Glenn contacts Celia. It's revealed the thugs are from an organization called Divine Wisdom, who are some evil mages. Celia mentions they can't do jack right now since those Divine Wisdom chumps sealed the academy. Glenn is all alone when suddenly some skeleton soldiers conjured by Stinkfoot show up. They waste the thug on Stinkfoot's side. Seeing this, Glenn and Josephine notice the bony bozos. Glenn tells his student to prep a spell against the skeletons while he bounces. Josephine casts something that stops the skellies. Meanwhile, Glenn starts preparing a legit powerful spell, and then unleashes it, destroying all the soldiers and wrecking part of the academy. But Glenn ends up messed up since he used magic too hardcore for his bod. Before he can do anything else, Stinkfoot rolls up and Glenn asks Josephine if she can zap Stinkfoot's weapons. She says she needs time to recharge, so Glenn pushes her into some bushes to solo Stinkfoot. This kicks off Glenn throwing down with Stinkfoot, both showing their skills to murk each other quickly. Glenn tries a spell to stop Stinkfoot's swords, and Stinkfoot tries to counter it, but Glenn psyched him out to take the hit. Josephine pops up and uses her power to dispel Stinkfoot's magic, letting Glenn smash him with a sword and finally defeat the loser. Stinkfoot then remembers who Glenn is, revealing Glenn is a mage killer working for the Empire. After saying that, Stinkfoot croaks and Glenn passes out from blood loss. Josephine tries healing Glenn with magic. After a few hours, Glenn wakes up and sees Josephine is passed out after draining all her power. Glenn decides to go after Jessica solo. After a few minutes, he arrives at the tower where she's at. Here it's revealed the dude behind this is their old teacher who became an influencer and took Glenn's old job. He made a magic circle to teleport Jessica to his crib. Determined, Glenn uses his own blood to bust the circle, successfully shattering all its layers. But he's left with no mojo. Luckily, Jessica reaches out and touches Glenn, revealing she has an amplifier ability that boosts the power of whoever she touches. With this new juice, Glenn wrecks the circle and throws down with the old teach, murking him and ending the beef. Afterwards, Glenn meets with Celia, who spills Jessica's true identity. But Glenn ain't surprised. Days later, Class 2 meets to discuss the magic competition, an event where all classes battle in different sports. Glenn assigns each student which sport to play, knowing all their strengths and weaknesses. The students trust their teacher more, but Glenn just wants them to win for his own benefit. The winning class's teacher gets a fat bonus check and Glenn needs the cash. In the evening, Class 2 gets into a fight about practice space with Class 1. Glenn steps in to stop the beef. The other teacher shows up and tells Glenn that Class 1 will take the W. Glenn decides to make a bet, offering 3 months of salary to the winner, which he immediately accepts, further increasing Glenn's worry about the event. He decides to train his students for several days and teach them how to use their skills to win. The day before the event, Jessica is on her house's balcony holding a necklace that is a memento from Queen Alicia. At that moment, Josephine appears, revealing that her family adopted Jessica, so Josephine's parents consider her a daughter too. They both wish each other good luck to win the competition. The next day, Queen Alicia heads to the event, and we see she has the same necklace as Jessica. However, her maid Eleanor offers the queen a different necklace, which she decides to wear for the event day. After the ceremony, the magic competition officially begins. Classroom 2 starts racking up points in the different sports. Meanwhile, we find out that Celia and Alicia are old friends, and Celia starts talking to her informally as the event continues. After several challenges, Jessica decides to participate in the mental defense game. A count named Zest uses magic to make participants defend against it. After several minutes, several participants fall one by one, leaving only Jessica and a student from Class 5 named Jail. Zest uses his spell called Mean Break, causing Jessica to fall to her knees. However, Jail is left unconscious after the attack, making Jessica the winner of the mental defenses and making Alicia proud of her. Meanwhile, Albert and Ari watch Glenn from a distance, as it seems they know him very well. It's revealed they are there to monitor the Queen's safety. In another scene, the students are on break, and Lynn asks Glenn for transmutation magic advice. Glenn decides to transform into Jessica to advise his student Lynn. Josephine greets Glenn thinking he's Jessica, and he pretends to be a student to try and eat the snack Josephine offers. However, the real Jessica appears, causing Josephine to realize Glenn's true identity and send him flying. A few minutes later, Jessica appears in front of Glenn and hands him a snack Josephine had prepared. Glenn happily starts eating and is surprised to see Alicia, since he worked for her a long time ago. Alicia tries to talk to her daughter and asks Glenn to protect her. Alicia then returns to the stadium but encounters the commander and his troop. The commander orders the soldiers to detain Alicia for a moment. Meanwhile, Glenn meets up with Jessica and reveals they tried to kill her years ago because of her oh-so-dangerous power. Then, Glenn tells Jessica that Alicia has, always loved her to infinity and beyond, and proposes accompanying her to have a totally not suspicious chat with Mommy Dearest. However, a ridiculous surplus of soldiers show up claiming they urgently need to execute Jessica for some bogus conspiracy against the Queen. They knock out poor Glendy and tie Jessica to a tree to off her. A blinding light appears and somehow Glenn has awakened from his nap and easily knocks out all the idiotic soldiers like flies. Glenn grabs Jessica and they dash away to safety as he calls up his BFF Celia. She says she can't help right now because Eleanor sneakily slapped a cursed collar on the Queen that would kill her if Celia tried anything. The only way to remove it is by killing Jessica, so Glenn is the Queen's only hope. After the gossip sesh, Albert and Ari appear ready to stir up petty drama. Ari suddenly attacks Glenn with a sword like a maniac, but Albert stops the pathetic fight by hitting Ari. Glenn then scolds Ari, revealing they both work for some shady organization with Celia. Glenn asks his old crew for assistance and they reluctantly agree to help. Glenn and Jessica keep running from the Queen's minions. Meanwhile, Albert and Ari decide to sneak back to the competition and promise Classroom 2 they'll rig it so they win. Those students start cheating their way to victory, tying for first place. For the final duel, Josephine conveniently demolishes her opponent in record time. After their suspicious comeback, Albert and Ari approach the Queen to get the medals, but it's Glenn and Jessica in magical disguise. This lets Glenn get close to the Queen, while Celia throws up a barrier to block the guards. The Queen orders Zelos to slay Jessica. Jessica starts bawling as Glenn attacks Zelos, and the Queen takes off Eleanor's pesky collar since Glenn disabled it. She hugs Jessica and apologizes, revealing her true feelings. Jessica weirdly forgives her just like that. Albert and Ari catch Eleanor and share she's in some shady cult, but she disappears before they can expose more truth. Finally, Glenn reveals that he saved Jessica as a child. He was the mage who rescued her when she was kidnapped, following the Queen's orders. They join the students in celebrating their victory, But Glenn soon realizes that they have foolishly spent all their prize money already. So the day after the big competition, Glenn just happened to run into his #1 fan Ari. She mentioned she'd now be stalking Jessica full-time as her new bodyguard, and would also be joining Glenn's class to keep an eye on him. How convenient. Glenn, always the social butterfly, introduced the socially awkward Ari to all his students. We watched in amusement as Ari tried to pretend to be a normal student instead of a Glenn groupie. After a few days, though, she shockingly made some real friends with Jessica and Josephine, which made Glenn so proud of his personal assassin. A few days later, Class 2 left for a field trip to some lab on an island. Upon arriving, Glenn ran into shady guy Albert, who claimed to be Jessica's real bodyguard. Albert warned Glenn that Ari might murder him in his sleep, but Glenn brushed it off. During beach day, the class had fun playing volleyball while Glenn frolicked with his students. You know, normal school field trip stuff. That night, Ari met up with Glenn and freaked out about why he quit the court since she only lived to serve him. Annoyed, Glenn told her off, leading to a big argument between stalker and stalky. Ari got jealous about Glenn's new BFFs Jessica and Josephine. Ari ran off crying, leaving our protagonist torn up about hurting his fans' feelings. The next day, the class headed to the lab, but Josephine distracted Ari by saying Glenn's name, causing her to trip like a love-struck fool. Despite Jessica and Josephine trying to help, Ari freaked out and said she hated them both. Glenn explained she was just jelly and apologized for her. They finally got to the lab, where the director Burks greeted them. He gave a quick disclaimer that they definitely did not create freakish human-animal hybrids, then explained they created freakish human-animal hybrids called chimeras. Josephine and Jessica then started geeking out about revival research and bringing back the dead. Burks mentioned the failed project Revival Life, which involved human cloning and sacrifices. Glenn pointed out this definitely unethical research had been rightfully shut down. Afterward, Ari had an emotional breakdown on the beach. Then a random guy showed up who was apparently her brother, even though she thought he was dead. Albert the shady bodyguard spied on them and tried to attack, but the mage Leonore showed up and they got into an insane magic battle. Albert realized Leonore was super dangerous. Ari's brother asked her to capture Jessica and kill Glenn to free him from some evil org. But Glenn confronted him and revealed he was with those evil creeps called Divine Wisdom, leading to a clash where Ari injured Glenn. Ari then kidnaps Jessica and runs off. Albert shows up with Glenn all banged up and begs Josephine to save him. While she's busy giving Glenn mouth-to-mouth, our boy starts cooking up a spell. After a few hours of smooching, Glenn wakes up and Albert spills the beans. The lab director was in cahoots with Ari and Eleanor's bro this whole time. After the big reveal, Albert hands Glenn his old six-shooter. The duo decide it's high time they rescue Jessica. Scene change, we see Jessica locked up, and Burks outlines his dastardly plot to use her origin magic to bring back the dead. But Eleanor realizes Glenn and Albert have rolled up on the hideout since Albert secretly low-jacked her ride earlier. In a panic, Burks sicks his chimera pets on the dynamic duo. But our heroes make quick work of the mutant freaks. Seeing his monsters are useless, Burks decides to throw down himself. Meanwhile, Eleanor tells Ari's bro Reiner to wrap things up because she's peacing out. Then Burks goes full beast mode, morphing into a giant chimera, and Albert tells Glenn to go on ahead while he deals with Ugly. Glenn finds Jessica, cue the teary reunion. But oh no. Ari jumps in between them, hell-bent on protecting her bro. Glenn tries talking sense into her, but she's not having it and starts attacking. Glenn dodges her attacks while Jessica pleads with Ari to stop. This gives Ari pause for a sec. Glenn seizes the opportunity and asks if Ari even knows her brother's name, causing her more doubt since she doesn't remember. While she's confused, Glenn whips up a gravity spell to immobilize her. Ari starts remembering her true origin, revealing she was the first successful experiment of Revival Life. A clone of a girl and the fake brother who killed her real brother, since her real bro was planning to stop the project with Glenn's help back when he was a soldier. After the traumatic memory flood, Ari breaks down crying. Glenn tries to talk sense into her, saying she now has new friends and a new reason to live. This gets through to Ari, who stands back up and starts eliminating all her remaining clones one by one. Meanwhile, we see Albert unleash his fire magic on Burks, reducing him to ashes. Glenn nullifies all of Reiner's spells and knocks him out cold with one punch. After the epic lab battle, everyone makes it back safely. Josephine forgives Ari for her actions and accepts her as a friend again. They all return to the city where we see Ari now living with Josephine and Jessica, being treated kindly by Josephine's parents as she tries to adjust to her new home. Glenn thanks Ari for saving him before, but then Josephine blushes remembering the kiss she gave Glenn. Seeing this, Ari gets mad at Glenn thinking he did something bad and starts chasing him around school. During the chase, Glenn trips on a carriage, but before being trampled by the horses, he's saved by a spell cast by a guy named Leo, who introduces himself as the new professor and Josephine's fiancé, since they promised to marry as kids. So Leo invites Glenn to observe his class and is super impressed with his teaching methods. Then Leo pops the question to Josephine, but she turns him down because she's got her heart set on exploring ancient ruins, not being some trophy wife. She tells Leo she's actually Glenn's girlfriend now. Leo is pissed and challenges Glenn to a duel, but not between them directly. Instead, their students gotta battle it out. Fight day arrives and it's non-stop carnage with both sides going hard. After 3 hours of teen wizards beating each other senseless, it ends in a tie. Despite no clear winner, Glenn congratulates his pupils for trying their best. Later, Leos blackmails Josephine into marrying him, or else he'll spill a secret that could endanger her buddies Jessica and Ari. Not cool. With no other options, Josephine reluctantly agrees. Glenn mysteriously disappears for a few days after Leos whooped his butt in front of the whole school. Wedding day rolls around, and just as Josephine is about to seal the deal with Leo, Glenn crashes the party. He tosses a smoke bomb, grabs Josephine, and the two make their getaway. On the way out, Glenn tells Ari to keep Jessica safe. Glenn explains to Josephine he was actually off training to defeat Leo, but suddenly some folks infected with angel dust, a substance that turns peeps into zombies, show up, and Glenn ruthlessly murders them all, freaking out Josephine with his remorseless killing. Then Leos appears. It's actually a dangerous ex-member of the royal court who killed the real Leos and took his form. Dude wants some ancient power to rule the world, but his schemes to find it were always foiled while working for the Empire. He attacks Glenn and seriously injures him, but Josephine saves Glenn just in time. Together they take down the Leo imposter, but he manages to escape. Josephine pleads for Glenn to return to his old self. In the end, Glenn happily resumes teaching the girls at the academy. And so we've reached the end of this amazing video that I'm sure you all loved just as much as I did. I mean, I absolutely hated it. It was garbage. But don't worry, I know you all enjoyed it just as much as I did, which is not at all. Anyway, that's all for now. Be sure to follow for more content that's just as awful as this. See you next time.